The law had a beginning. I mention this because a lot of people, some people I should say, in the Hebrew roots movement don't realize the law did not exist in the Garden of Eden, and it didn't exist after the fall, and it didn't exist with Cain and Abel, or with Abraham, right, or with Noah.
What's up? So I want to continue my response to Mike Winger's series about the Hebrew roots movement, but it's kind of hard to respond to things in a minute per topic. So I want to do a little bit more long form thing here, and then I'll have a playlist of my responses to his first video, but this is going to primarily cover the first section, at least, of his second video, and let's get right into it.
The Bible tells us this very clearly. So Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 2. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant.
Right, the covenant. But some of them had some of the law.
The people that were alive at the time of the giving of the law at Horeb, they're the first receivers of this new covenant, along with the commands that come into the covenant.
Except for the commands about the Sabbath.
There's long before it exists. We have Cain and Abel, who are aware of sacrifice. We have Noah, who's aware of clean and unclean animals.
And we'll get to this a little bit later when we touch on Abraham.
We see where Paul explains that the law had a beginning. He says, this is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. This seems really basic, but one of the reasons I bring this up, there's the idea that Abraham had the law of Moses. And so they get that from Genesis 26:5, which says, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. But we just got clear indication from Deuteronomy that whatever Genesis 26:5 is talking about, it's definitely not saying that Abraham had the law of Moses because it didn't exist for 430 more years. We are getting clear indications that there's a beginning point. Now, what that means, though, with Genesis 26:5 is Abraham did actually have some sort of law. Abraham knew about what God had told him to do, and even though it wasn't the law of Moses, it was still okay to call it God's charge, like what God tells you to do, his commandments, what God orders you to do, his statutes, like the principles, the laws of God, moral truth, perhaps, that God has revealed to Abraham when he says, go out of this land, go over here, do this thing, live this way. He does those things, and in that, he's fulfilling God's commandments to him, even though it's not the law of Moses.
So you say it's not the law of Moses, but like I said, Sabbath, clean and unclean, sacrifices, these had all been revealed already. So the idea that the law and knowledge about God itself is progressive, there's no reason to think that Abraham didn't know about these things. So when he says, Abraham kept my law, and that he was chosen because God knew that he would teach his law to his children, what law is he talking about? It's the very laws that Christians want to do away with. And to be sure, Abraham probably didn't have tassels on his garments. He probably didn't have any knowledge that there would be a Levitical priesthood, which was going to come from him.
But he's not aware of the law of Moses, because the Bible's clear that those guys didn't have that. So what's my point with that? It's just to say this. The law had a beginning point, and when it began, it was just for Israel. It wasn't for Abraham. It wasn't for Noah. It wasn't for Adam and Eve. It wasn't for Cain and Abel. And it wasn't for those outside of Israel. Deuteronomy 4:8. And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today? What's the point? Nobody else has got these laws like this. Like this law of Israel, it's only known to Israel. There is no other nation like it. In fact, that's what makes Israel peculiar of a people, right? A unique people.
He just picked these totally arbitrary things to just make them unique. No, they're righteous, but they had to be delivered from these holy, righteous, good, spiritual laws.
So it was only for Israel. That was the nature of the law. It was a covenant between God and Israel, and it was given through the hands of Moses. That's the law of Moses. So what about Gentiles, though? Some say, well, but the Old Testament, it says, like in Exodus 12:49 says, there shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. And they use this, I've seen this use this concept in Exodus 12:49 to say that, see, the law was for all people. It was one law for whether you're Israel or not Israel. But that's not what it says, is it? I mean, you already see it right there. The stranger who sojourns among you.
And how much more for those who are fully grafted into Israel through Messiah, who is revealed by these very laws.
Meaning that as a nation who has laws, they wouldn't have a separate set of laws for people who are not part of the Jewish bloodline. If you live in Israel, you live under the Israeli laws. You have laws for all the people, and that's consistent, and that's just good law, right? Like, that's just good law is what that is. The Gentiles outside of Israel, here's the next question, right? We've eliminated Adam, Eve, Abraham, Noah, all those people. They were not under the law of Moses.
So I agree that this idea that Abraham had my laws, it's fairly weak on the Messianic or Hebrew roots side, mainly because we don't exactly know what it is that Abraham did or didn't know. And then for that matter, Noah, Adam and Eve, all of them. But that's an unknown. What we do know is what had been revealed to them, which was some of it. So that's partly true.
We've eliminated the non-Israeli nations, and then finally we can ask the question, like, what about people who were outside of Israel? What sort of law were they under? I think that Romans 2:12 gives us a hint at that. It says, "For all who've sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who've sinned under the law will be judged by the law." They were never told to go into other nations and teach those people the law of God.
So I'm skipping this part because we pretty much agree on it as far as what Romans is talking about. The Gentiles didn't have the law of Moses. I would argue that it was God's original intent that Israel would share the knowledge of him with the nations around them, presumably to the entire world. I've made this case in another video, but essentially Levi was only chosen as priest in substitution for the entirety of Israel. And if all of Israel were going to be priests, who were they going to be priests to? It was the nations. They were to be a light to the nations. The temple was going to be a house of prayer for all nations. The problem is that they failed.
They weren't told to do this. They didn't do this.
So by the time of the New Testament, they were proselytizing, at least to the dispersion, and many Gentiles were coming in with them. These are the converts, the people in Acts that were from Arabia and Cappadocia and all these other places. They even had a distinct category, God-fearers, those Gentiles that were on their way to becoming Jewish but hadn't taken that full last step of conversion. But anyway, I'm skipping the rest. Okay.
All right. Third big picture point before we get to Matthew. The law had an exchange coming. The law of Moses, it had an exchange coming. So let me read the passage, and then we'll read a New Testament commentary on that passage. So Jeremiah 31, verse 31 says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like
the law,
the covenant
covenant
that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord." So there's a new covenant coming, and it will be unlike the old covenant, which was the one brought through Moses. "For this is the covenant
what?
that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my
Covenant.
My law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor, saying, and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." So we have this idea that the law, it comes at a certain point in time. It comes just to a certain people. I've established that with my first two big picture points. And the third point is, and it has an exchange coming, where this law will be set aside for another law that will be written in our hearts. It'll be different than the old.
So you establish no such thing from this passage. There's no reason to think that God's holy, righteous, and good law would have been changed. The problem with the first covenant was the people. They couldn't keep the law. But in Christ, we can by the power of the Holy Spirit, and we definitely can when we are glorified and become like him. And that is when no one will teach their neighbor, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know him.
Now, some people want to say that the new covenant is just taking the old one and writing it in our hearts.
It's writing his law in our hearts. And it's God's prerogative whether or not to change aspects of the law. It's important to note that the law wasn't completely given at Sinai. It was added to due to transgressions along the way in the wilderness. Whether or not those are considered temporary or revelations of his explicit desire for humankind, it's not as obvious, but the ones that he spoke with his mouth, he wrote with his finger, I think we should expect that God himself would not change and those expectations would stay the same.
We'll actually see later in the New Testament, this is the law of Christ that he's referring to, right? It does say he'll write his law within us, but it doesn't necessarily, but we know that the law can refer to the law of Moses. It can refer to whatever law Abraham was aware of. So we'll actually see later in the New Testament, this is the law of Christ that he's referring to.
So covenant means law, and law means whatever law we want it to mean, regardless of what Jeremiah's hearers would have understood it to be. They don't want to be facetious, but that's what I'm hearing. So I'm going to play a clip that was actually from earlier in the video, but it highlights exactly what I'm discussing right now. And just pay attention to the ways that he acknowledges the inconsistencies, but yet somehow insists that it's consistently the way that they want it to be.
Because the covenant, in fact, if you do a study on the terms covenant and law, covenant of God, law of God, covenant of Moses, law of Moses, that kind of thing, these are sometimes used synonymously. They're connected. So we're not separating. They're different things, but sometimes they overlap.
I won't argue that there's nuance and they can appear to mean the same thing, but the covenant contained the law. The law was the terms of the covenant. And again, it was the covenant that was the problem, not the law. Now, more specifically, it was the people that were the problem, but the covenant had terms, do this or else that. Whereas in the new covenant, it's, I'm going to do this for you. And that's that. The law under the new covenant has no power to destroy us because that's not part of the new covenant. And it's written on our hearts, so we don't even want to disobey it. And at some point, we won't be able to.
So Hebrews 8, verse 13 gives us commentary on the meaning of Jeremiah 31, this prophecy of the new covenant. Remember, Jesus brought the new covenant in his blood? Well, it comments on Jeremiah 31, and it says, in speaking of a new covenant,
we're back to this again.
He makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Hebrews being written long after, it's like talking about this sort of slow, gradual impact that the work of Jesus, this new covenant, was having. And it was now becoming old and ready to vanish away. It was like a gradual thing. This is a passage I haven't heard anybody comment on as part of the Hebrew Roots movement. I'd be interested to hear them comment on it in context.
I don't really see the problem with it. He seems to be referring prophetically to the time when Titus would come and destroy the temple and the city, and they wouldn't be left with anything. He's talking to, in Hebrews, a people that are bummed out that they can't participate in temple worship. I don't think they're going to be very excited that the law, which they're zealous for, and myriads of people were zealous for, is going to be done away with and made obsolete. They were wanting to participate in the law. What he's talking about is the covenant. And it's getting ready to vanish. Well, Jesus Christ was getting ready to appear the second time, and he still is. And again, that is when the people will no longer have to be told, know the Lord, for they will all know him. Again, this is when the new covenant will be fully established. It's been ratified, begun in Christ, and he accomplished everything that needs to be accomplished, but it's not completely here yet.
And we'll scroll down a bit and we'll look at Hebrews 9. And it says, which is symbolic for this present age, according to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body. So this is obviously talking about the Levitical law, right? Food and drinks and various washings. So we're talking kosher laws and regulations for the body imposed, and this is the key, until the time of Reformation. Hebrews 9 is saying that covenant, which has been replaced, it was only in place until the time of Reformation. It was like a placeholder for the coming new covenant.
Again, I don't really see a problem with this. It's talking about the covenant, for one, and for two, we don't really know exactly what the time of Reformation is. Now, you believe that you know, and you might go down to verse 11 where it says, "But Christ came as high priest of good things to come," and say, well, that's clearly the time of Reformation. But it's really talking about the clearing of the conscience. That was the subject of the previous verses. You may very well be correct in your interpretation, but that doesn't really change anything about the law. The laws regarding the temple service were pertaining to that space, that holy space, and the priesthood and how they can approach God. We no longer require that to approach God. However, in the future, from Ezekiel, from other places in the Old Testament prophecies, we know that the Levitical priesthood will remain even during the reign of Messiah.